Tonight, Bruce Lehrmann finally named as the man accused of rape in Queensland. But does this mean another trial by media? And Linda Burney, tipped to be our next Governor-General? I mean, surely that's a joke after she flopped trying to sell us The Voice. And the RSL's latest inclusive poppy. Do we really need them now in rainbow colours? I'll also talk to the new head of our top farmers organisation. On his first day on the job, he's today launched a new campaign against the Albanese government's woke agenda, how it's hurting farmers. But first, it's a day where it seems the West really is falling. Attacked from outside, crumbling from inside. Wars from the outside, white-anting inside, and now one of the worst mass shootings in US history. In fact, it was spooky today hearing Prime Minister Anthony Albanese over at the White House with the president of our most critical ally read out a poem that's actually been in my mind, even though I doubt he understood how right it was for our times.
The familiar words of William Butler Yeats. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Things
fall apart, and at about exactly that time in Lewiston, in Maine, the US state, a gunman with an AR-15 style rifle, apparently with laser optics, went on a shooting spree at a bowling alley in a bar and shot dead at least 22 people.
At approximately 6:56 this evening, a couple of shooting incidents occurred here with multiple casualties in the city of Lewiston. And police are currently searching for a Robert R. Card, 4/4 of 1983 of Bowdoin. Card is considered armed and dangerous.
The shooter is still at large as we speak and is being suspected of being this man, twice divorced Robert Card, a trained firearms expert with the US Army Reserve who spent a couple of weeks this year in a mental hospital after saying he'd been hearing voices and threatened to shoot up a military base. I mean, you've got to ask, how does a guy like that slip through the cracks? How is he left with weapons? Things fall apart. Now, there's no point going on about Americans' gun laws. It's so boring now because they won't change. It's not just the amendment, but there's no will. The more dangerous the US seems, the more people will want guns to protect themselves. But this is going to send a message to China and to Russia and another American enemy, Iran, that here it is more evidence of something they've been telling themselves for years now. America is fractured. It is divided. It's getting weaker. It's losing its moral fibre, like much of the rest of the free world. In fact, one of the 7 men who run China now, one of the 7 on its ruling Politburo, even wrote a book about this called America Against America. And that is why China these days dares to be so aggressive. He thinks America's weak. Now, it's true that US President Joe Biden today did tell Albanese at a big dinner for him at the White House that, by golly, we're together in an alliance to defend our values from people like that.
We must continue to advance freedom, continue to defend the values of great democracies, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and freedom from fear.
Freedom from fear. Meanwhile, somewhere behind him, bang, 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 bang. And then externally, there's the wars. The enemies of freedom, Russia, Iran, China, have started or funded 2 wars now. An invasion of Ukraine, now this war against Israel that was launched by the Hamas terror regime of Gaza. And China is now considering a 3rd one as well, invading Taiwan, while the US is still led by a president so old and so clearly in decline, fading, weak. Things fall apart. But it's not just in the US, which we count on to defend us, since our army is so tiny and badly equipped. I want to say something about the Albanese government as well. In this war for freedom, our government is also faltering. And that's particularly now after that unbelievably brutal Hamas attack in Israel, killing 1,400 Israelis in such gruesome ways. And it needs saying particularly today, because today Foreign Minister Penny Wong said she's going to give about $15 million of your money to help the people of Gaza. And that's on top of $10 million she's already promised. And it's for food and water and sanitation and medical supplies. But I've got to ask why? Why now? And why give $25 million of your money to the people of Gaza without conditions. Why isn't Wong saying to Hamas, which rules Gaza and committed these atrocities and has more than 200 people still held hostage under the city, yes, we will give you, your people, all this help and even more, but only after you release every one of the more than 200 hostages you took, many of them women and children, even toddlers. Free them for their sake and for the sake of the Palestinians you rule, for the 25 million that we will give you. And why not? Why shouldn't we ask that? Why should we care more about the Palestinians of Gaza than their own government? Why should we be taking the pressure off Hamas to release hostages, to stop firing rockets at Israel, and to, how about, encourage them to start giving their own people the food and the water, and how about an economy and peace that they deserve? Every dollar we give right now for food and water is a dollar that Hamas does not have to spend itself on those things. That frees up money that it then can spend on even more rockets and guns. It's fired, 10,000 rockets at Israel already. Look, we already have aid groups, right, wanting to bring fuel to Gaza as well, after they accused Hamas of stealing earlier supplies from aid groups, petrol that was meant for civilians and that's been stored in these massive fuel tanks, says Israel. Now, we're told, why take this hard line against the poor civilians? All right, Hamas is stealing this stuff and blah, blah, and firing rockets and all. But Hamas doesn't represent the poor Palestinians of Gaza. And we got to help them. Except that's not quite true, is it? Because the people of Gaza actually voted for Hamas in their one and only election 17 years ago. All right, 17 years ago, but most opinion polls now are showing that most of them still support Hamas fighting Israel. None have marched for peace in this war. So, why are we now protecting them from some of the consequences of Hamas deliberately starting this war by massacring Jews? And you might be wondering, why doesn't then the Albanese government demand something in exchange for this $25 million that we're giving? Release the hostages. Who with a heart could object? And put the heat on Hamas to show that it really does care about its civilians. Put the heat on Hamas and not always on Israel. Let me tell you something about that. This crumbling, this thing's falling apart. One thing our insanely high immigration intake has done, and this is going to explain maybe why the Albanese government isn't getting so tough on Hamas. One thing it has done is bring in more Muslims to Australia in just 5 years, between 2016 and 2021. More Muslims brought in than there are Jews in this entire country. Huge numbers. In fact, there are about 8 times more Muslims here than Jews now. More than 800,000. And we have not heard a single Muslim organisation condemn Hamas for attacking Israel, committing those atrocities. Not one. And this is a problem. Or Labor might think there's electoral opportunity here because most Muslims are in Labor seats. The seat of Watson, for instance, in Western Sydney, that's held by Labor's Workplace Relations Minister, Tony Burke. 25% of voters there are Muslim. In nearby Blaxland, held by Education Minister Jason Clare, stunning 32% of voters there are Muslim. In Laylaw, Victoria, Labor held 15%. I mean, the Muslim vote is very important to Labor. And particularly now with the Greens going all out against Israel, Labor's got to protect this left wing from a Greens attack. And it's important for Labor at the council level too, this Muslim vote. This is Bilal El-Hayek, Mayor of the Canterbury Bankstown Council. The Sydney Council has just decided to fly the Palestinian flag during this war in support of people led by the world's worst terrorist group. There's got to be a law against this, doesn't there? So no, this Albanese government isn't going to go hard in support of Israel. You've seen that, aren't you? In fact, it's doing the very barest minimum. The Prime Minister, for instance, hasn't even corrected the false impression he gave last week that Israel bombed the hospital in Gaza deliberately, when in fact it was a Palestinian rocket which misfired and hit the car park. Things fall apart, particularly in the West, which has run a recklessly huge immigration program that now has Labor dancing to the tune of a Muslim vote that it thinks is hostile to the only democracy in the Middle East and to our strongest friend in the Middle East. And now there's Albanese off to visit the Chinese dictator now. Notice how it's also gone quieter on China. So forgive me if I end by quoting the rest of that verse, not just the line that Albanese rattled off to impress Joe Biden, not understanding what it meant. Things fall apart. The centre will not hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Isn't that where we are? Well, to the late-breaking news, a gag order has finally been dropped, allowing us now to name the high-profile identity who was in the papers charged with 2 counts of rape in Toowoomba, Queensland. It turns out that man is Bruce Lehrmann, who was earlier charged, of course, with the rape in Parliament House of his fellow Liberal staffer, Brittany Higgins. Now, Lehrmann denied that, as he denies these latest charges, and that earlier Higgins case, that collapsed with the charge against him withdrawn. And the first trial in the Higgins case actually ended with the jury dismissed because of a juror's misconduct. The second was called up by the Crown prosecutor. Now, Lehrmann could not be named in this new case, the Queensland one, because of a Queensland law that said a person accused of rape could not be named until they were actually committed for trial. So they had to pass that barrier. And that was to save some of the accused men, in particular, from being ruined by vexatious allegations of rape that turned out, they were innocent, but careers then ruined. Allegations, say, from revenge by a former partner. That law was changed last month.
Part of the basis of this protection for accused rapists is that women maliciously make up complaints to damage reputations. These rape myths have no place in our society.
Now, the facts of this Queensland case are different to the Higgins one. Lehrmann allegedly had sex 3 times with the complainant about 8 months after Higgins accused him of rape. Once in the night and twice the morning after, which the woman said was rape because Lehrmann, she didn't know, was not wearing a condom, which was against her wishes. Now, we understand that he intends to plead not guilty to the charges. Joining me is Chris Merritt, Vice President of the Rule of Law Institute of Australia and columnist with the Australian newspaper. Chris Merritt, thank you for your time. There's not obvious much we can say, and we don't want to repeat the circus that happened the first the earlier case, the Higgins case, and trial this, hold a media trial. Was it fair for Queensland to change that law, which has the effect that Lehrmann can once again be tried in the media before even being committed for trial?
Well, despite appearances, reports that I've seen just this afternoon say that this change was planned. It was a long-standing change. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it's fair. There are 2 potential triggers for when people can be publicly named. The trigger that has been abandoned in Queensland is when they're committed for trial, and Queensland has now fallen into line with most other jurisdictions. So people accused of sexual assault can be named after they're charged. But let's keep this in perspective. No formal plea has been entered. It's been reported that Mr. Lehrmann intends to plead not guilty. He hasn't been before a committal hearing, and remember, a committal hearing can result in charges being thrown out. The purpose of a committal hearing is to run a ruler over the prosecution's case and see whether it justifies testing those accusations in court. It gives the defence an opportunity to review that as well. So the first real test for this will be whether Mr. Lehrmann is committed for trial. Now, This will be very different to the previous proceedings that collapsed. These are the proceedings against Mr. Lehrmann, which he continually denied any guilt. They'll be different in this regard. In the ACT, there was no option at all of a judge-alone trial aimed at avoiding the risk of a biased jury pool. You'll recall that there was massive prejudicial publicity, primarily out of the Canberra Press Gallery. That's the second point of difference. This is Queensland. I assume that people will understand that there is no political angle to this, and it will be covered purely as a trial based on the law. There's a possibility that Mr. Lehrmann might seek a judge's permission for a judge-alone trial, which is an option in Queensland. It's not a right. It depends on whether a judge considers that as necessary. So on those two aspects alone, this would be very different, and hopefully it will be argued out purely on the law rather than the politics.
Plus, of course, there's not that political incentive to try it in the media. There's not a Morrison government to destroy as well, so that factor is removed. Now, Chris, not speaking of this particular case, but in general, when you've got people attempted to say, one woman accusing a man of rape, benefit of the doubt, not found guilty, but two, that smells. What does the law say about that?
Nothing. Mr. Lehrmann goes into this proceeding an innocent man. His presumption of innocence is untested, unchallenged, I mean. He came out of the collapse proceedings in the ACT an innocent man. He goes into these proceedings with his presumption of innocence intact. The fact that there are other accusations is completely irrelevant. This case will be argued purely on admissible evidence, and we're yet to see what calibre that evidence is.
Well said. Well, the plural of allegation is not proof. Thank you so much for your time, Chris Merritt. Really appreciate that. Well, joined now by Nationals frontbencher Barnaby Joyce, the former Deputy Prime Minister, as always on a Thursday. Barnaby Joyce, thank you for your time. I want to go back to what I started the show with. Should we be giving $25 million to help the people of Gaza without saying first to the people that run Gaza, release the hostages, release the 200 plus hostages you've got?
We should most definitely be saying release the hostages. We want to do everything we possibly can to de-escalate what's happening there. I don't think, Andrew, the Australian people understand how grave this could be. If there's an Iranian backing of Hamas, which is obviously Sunni, and then you've got Hezbollah in the north, which is Shiite, and behind them you've got Iran, which has been doing everything it can to make itself a corridor to the Mediterranean, and you've got in Yemen the Houthi, who are also trying to send missiles into Israel. And this has been if the architecture of this comes from Tehran, then we might have an issue that's vastly bigger than what we see on television sets. And we're going to be really, really, really careful of what happens here. And Hamas should realise that, don't do it.
Well, I think
you're just a pawn in this. You're just a pawn. You'll get wiped out.
People of Gaza also have got to realise there's a price for being led by people like Hamas. If they start a war, there have to be consequences. Now, I don't like the suffering either, but until there's a price for war, you're not going to have peace. And you've also, meanwhile, got 200 hostages, more than, some of them infants, in the tunnels underneath Gaza. I mean, we can't just say, "Oh, look, here's the money," and that's it.
It's abominable. It's abominable what this criminal group Hamas is doing. They're evil. No one's arguing about that. They're totally and utterly evil. But we can't, therefore, condone any innocent person being killed. And I honestly think that the vast majority, I don't know, I'm making this supposition, the vast majority of people in the Gaza Strip have no real say about who leads them. This is a criminal organisation. It's like being led by the mafia. Like the mafia in Sicily. The Sicilians don't. I don't know whether they have a
vote
real
for them in 2006.
say in what happens. Well, look, I
vote for them.
Just look at the wider ramification. The wider ramification for the world, Andrew, is if this thing blows up, it's not just going to blow up in the Middle East. It's going to blow up for all of us. And Hamas needs to be dealt with severely. No one is arguing about that. But we've got to understand if this turns into a wider engagement, and the trigger with that would be Hezbollah, with South Yemen, the Yemeni Hutus. It's with Syria becoming engaged in it. Iran comes in, and the response there, we're talking about possible nuclear war. And nobody wants that.
No, but nor does Israel want just to be terrorists to attack it so savagely and get away with it. That's only going to embolden more attacks. That's the thing. No arguments there whatsoever, Andrew. No arguments there whatsoever. The provocateur was Hamas. No arguments there whatsoever. Now, the Prime Minister has not yet visited Israel, and the Israeli Prime Minister hasn't also returned his call. That doesn't sound very hugger-mugger, friendly, we've got your back, Israel, and Israel thinking they've got a friend in Australia.
No, it doesn't. And, without a shadow of a doubt, the instigation of this was Hamas. There is no equivocation about that. And therefore, the role of the Prime Minister is to reach out to Israel, a democratic nation who has been attacked by a terrorist organisation, and to straight away build that bridge. Now, if you have other concerns in other areas, they're not going to be dealt with unless you actually reach out to Israel. If you say, I don't want innocent people killed in the Gaza Strip, and nobody does, then you reach out to Israel and you talk to Benjamin Netanyahu, who, through whatever you may think, is a democratically elected leader of a nation which has, within its Knesset, Arab members of their parliament. This is a democratic country. And you've got to... Hamas is not democratic. It's a terrorist organisation, right? So we've got a clear differentiation.
It's amazing, the double standards. People, particularly ABC, seem to be holding Israel to infinitely higher standards. In a sense, they should, but they should at least be very, very clear that Hamas is absolutely evil, and it shouldn't be cutting them slack. I'll show you reviews later in the show what it's up to with that. Barnaby Joyce, the Daily Mail reports that there are rumours that Indigenous Australian Minister Linda Burney, who made a complete hash of selling the Voice, is now being sounded out to be our next Governor-General. Now, Barnaby, I wouldn't have believed it, but the Mail does say that her office refused to comment when it asked about those rumours. Now, surely Linda Burney as Governor-General, that couldn't be right or appropriate, could it?
Oh, look, there are times I actually feel sorry for Linda. I mean, and that's because she really struggled, didn't she? But look, if you want to pick an Indigenous person, an Aboriginal person to be the Governor-General, I'll give you a suggestion. Mark Gordon-Ella, captain of the Wallabies 10 times, never put a foot wrong, overwhelmingly held in respect by the Australian people. Would we just love Mark Gordon-Ella to be captain of the Wallabies currently? We might have a chance of, giving, I don't know, Fiji a run for their money. But, there are some great Indigenous people out there, and, Miss Burney might be in the mix, but Mark Gordon-Ella. There's my suggestion. Australia. Mark Gordon-Ella.
I tell you what, at least
Matraville High, Randwick, Wallabies. What else would you want?
Yeah, well, at least you're actually naming someone who would be a uniting figure. I'm not quite sure what the grasp of constitutional law is, but I'm prepared to give it a go. But Linda Burney is just fresh from totally mismanaging, totally incompetently so, a campaign that divides us by race. I mean, the Governor-General says to unite, not divide. So I just think this has got real whiskers on it. Barnaby Joyce, thank you so much for your time.
It's a flight of fancy. You're welcome. Look at this rain. Look at this. How do you like this? This is great. Puts water in the water tanks. Unreal.
Mate, it's beautiful country you're in. Beautiful. I love it. That is Australia. Thank you, mate. After the break, the new leader of the country's top farmers organisation is one day in the job and already he's got a new campaign against the government's woke agenda, how it's hurting farmers. I'll talk to him after this. News that Israel has just launched a targeted raid, they call it, into Gaza with tanks and infantry, but then withdrew again. So it looks like, they're doing special raids, operations, scoping sort of things, while meanwhile 300,000 reservists are being trained for the fight of their lives. Our biggest farmers organisation has decided to go in hard as of today, hard against the ideological crusades of the Albanese government that's so stifling business and hitting farmers especially. The National Farmers Federation has a new president. First full day of work today. It's Wimmera farmer David Yohinki, and today it also starts a social media campaign against aspects of the government's renewable energy crusade, for instance. Its pro-union industrial relations changes. Its green plans to flush more water down our rivers, waters that farmers need. And then this live sheep export ban and so on. Now, maybe, of course, the government could get away with some of this stuff when we had La Nina and lots of rain and record crops and high prices. But now we switch to an El Nino that's less rain, smaller crops in some areas, and a huge fall in prices for cattle and sheep. In Western Australia, the collapse in prices, that's partly the live export industry, was so bad that lambs were selling for as little as $1. $1, less than the price of a chop. Joining me is David Yohinki. David Yohinki, thank you so much indeed for your time and congratulations on your win. So this would be no time to be hitting farmers with ideological campaigns, like on global warming or industrial relations or environment or water releases and all that. And you're kicking off a campaign on just those things hitting the Albanese government. What's your problem?
Well, as we've described, there's a lot of things that are going on in agriculture, and what we want is stability, we want certainty, and we want to be able to do our business in a straightforward, easy manner. But with the compounding effect of this legislation that's currently being proposed in Canberra, it's really giving us a lot of fear when we talk about water, when we talk about land, talk about workforce, and even access to markets. So today we've launched a campaign called Keep Farmers Farming, and the centrepiece of that is highlighting the combination of all of these policies that are currently being discussed. If they do get up, the absolute impact that it will have across the agricultural family, the agricultural community, and wanting to highlight that it's not just one portfolio, it's the whole of government that has responsibility to look after our production, because if farmers produce less, it's got to cost Aussies more.
Well, let me go through some of those. I mean, one of the hot political issues, I don't know if this goes really crucial to farming, but it is very hot in some parts of the country. Transmission lines, this energy revolution we're supposed to be having, with these huge transmission lines being built over farmland to hook up all these solar and wind farms that are going to be springing up like mushrooms all over the joint. What's the issue there? What do you want done?
Look, per se, agriculture's not afraid of embracing renewables, but it's got to be on our terms. Farmers shouldn't be dictated to where transmission lines are going to go or where renewables need to be placed. We want to be part of the conversation early on so the farmers are empowered to make that decision, especially how it interferes with their businesses, interferes with their production. Because like a lot of things that are happening within agriculture, if that land is lost, if that production is gone, we lose it forever. And we don't want that to occur without there being an informed decision. And what we're seeing now is farmers being consulted at the back end of the processes, not having the ability to be a part of the decision-making process, let alone even understanding what the bigger picture is of what the objective of how these transmission lines will roll out, where the renewable energy energy parks where the wind and solar might be placed, let alone then how they can interact as a community and not divide the farming community in the meantime.
Now, I've also been really suspicious for a long time of water allocations, taking water off farmers, irrigators particularly, and putting it in the river for the river health. Now, sometimes, of course, I can see it's necessary, got to look after people downstream. I've got all that. But often it seems to me a little bit of nature worship and all that, and farmers getting ripped off quite badly. What's your issue here?
Well, we've currently got a plan for the Murray-Darling Basin, which is about sharing the water between productive agriculture and the environment and achieving environmental outcomes. Now, this plan is getting close to the end of its time frame, but what we need is the government to settle down and go, we need to be able to spend more time in achieving the same outcomes environmentally with the water that they've already got. There's numerous projects on the table that can achieve flooding, that can achieve forestry growth, that can achieve water health benefits, as well as how we can manage our fish stocks within the river without taking more water. We want those ideas, those opportunities fully explored before any more water is taken out of the pool of irrigation water that agriculture relies on. Because we know if these buybacks go ahead, it's going to cost the agricultural community around about $9 billion.
Look, it's just incredible, some of the government decisions that sort of wipe out whole sectors of farming. I mean, one of my uncles used to have a fruit block up near Nia West, on the Murray, near the Murray. And I was learned the other day there's only 2 blocks of fruit trees still there in the entire area that he's at. I mean, it's just incredible how we do these things to farmers without really thinking twice about it. Well, David Yohiki, the farmers help build this country. I think they don't get much of a look in sometimes in politics. And I do think it's time that I've got to be honest, National Farmers Federation, I think it needed to muscle up, and I'm glad you're doing that straight off the bat in your first week in the job. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and I just want to keep saying that our job is to fight for farmers. We want strong members for the National Farmers Federation, and the only way we can do that is making sure that we focus for the benefit of their members, the farmers on the ground, and we'll continue to do that.
Well, strength to your shearing arm. Good on you. Well, after the break, the ABC goes from shocking to disgusting in its coverage of the war against Israel. New examples today of how it's going really hard on Israel, the democracy that's under attack, and soft on the worst Islamist terror group in the world. Plus, I'll cross to Army Horowitz, this time in Jerusalem, to see it all for himself. The ABC keeps shocking me with its vicious bias against Israel, a democracy that's now fighting Hamas, a terrorist group which runs Gaza and murdered 1,400 Israelis 3 weeks ago. Now, last night, for instance, I gave examples of the incredibly hostile questions that an ABC reporter in the National Press Club fired at Israel's ambassador after he listed the many atrocities Hamas had committed in that slaughter, like what it did to a pregnant woman and her baby. But unbelievably, it's got even worse than that. Worse even than the ABC yesterday on AM, reporting a woman from Israel, one of the hostages had been released, only about 4 of them, saying, I was treated well, without saying, by the way, mentioning what she'd also said, and they beat me. She's 85 years old. They beat me with sticks, and the ABC admitted that bit. Seriously. But it got much worse after the Israeli ambassador's lecture. Straight after he finished, the ABC turned for comments to a former ABC Middle East reporter, Nicole Johnson, whose only comment on the ambassador's long list of Hamas atrocities, children burned alive, women tortured, and more, her one comment was that the ambassador might be exaggerating the number of babies beheaded.
What's your response to that and the graphic images that he invoked in there?
Some people would come out and say that the issue of dozens of Israeli children being decapitated still hasn't been verified.
I'm just so speechless. I'm sure you figured out how appalling that is. And then she said this.
He went on to talk about Hamas accusing it of using human shields. That's a really interesting one. I covered the 2012 war and the 2014 war, and that accusation was constantly made, and we never found it to be correct.
This is the ABC's expert brought in from outside to give expert commentary. I mean, what an idiotic claim. Hamas has actually issued an order telling its people not to flee Gaza. You can read it on the internet. It's right there, because it needs those people there as protection or to provide the corpses to impress the media. Now, if Hamas didn't want human shields, if it didn't want its own people dead for the cameras, why does it make Palestinians face the bombing above ground? Why does it ban them from hiding in the 500 kilometres of tunnels it's built right under Gaza for its terrorists? No, you can't come down here where it's safe. You've got to stay up there. But Nicole Johnson still hadn't finished. She even claimed that Hamas might actually want a peace deal, with Israel, despite the fact it's just caused the war to the knife, She did admit, I'll give her some credit, its official charter had called for Israel to be destroyed. They actually called for Jews to be murdered as well. But it now, she said, had a revised charter.
There are some analysts who would argue that Hamas later reviewed its charter, and when it reviewed its charter, it said that it would accept a Palestinian state on the 1967 lines, and that was considered by many to be a sort of implicit recognition of Israel.
Get off the grass. Go type it in the Google machine for yourself. Hamas Charter, 2017 version. Even this new and supposedly peaceful one says, and I quote, the establishment of Israel is entirely illegal. Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. That's from between the River Jordan on the eastern border of Israel to the Mediterranean Sea on its western one. So everything in between, which is the entire country of Israel, must be gone and replaced, of course, by an Islamic state. Hamas kills, it butchers, it rapes, it tortures, it kidnaps, and it lies. It steals aid meant for its people and rejects peaceful war. All that, and our ABC looks at the mayhem and bloody misery that Hamas has caused, and it says, those Israelis exaggerating. They're so brutal. Well, at least one of this show's regular commentators has gone to Israel to find out for himself what's going on. Filmmaker and commentator Ami Horowitz joins me from Jerusalem. Ami, thank you for your time. Look, you've been to Israel many times. This must feel really different now, what you're seeing.
Yeah, it sure is. It's look, you walk the streets of Israel, of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and there's a pall everywhere. There's a sense of sorrow through the streets. Everybody you speak to, everybody I know, has lost somebody, knew somebody who lost somebody in these horrific attacks, and they're just gearing up for the next phase. They know what's coming is going to be bad. It's going to be bloody. Again, every day you hear sirens of rocket attacks coming to Israel. The situation is as tense as I've ever seen it in my life. I think it's as tense, if not more tense, than anybody in Israel has ever seen it in maybe their lifetimes. It's incredible. It's difficult, but this is how this country must persevere.
Now, I assume that you had to, I think commercial flights to Ben Gurion Airport between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem have stopped, and you've had to go through Amman, Jordan to get to Israel. What did you see there?
Yeah, I did. And I've been to Amman a number of times. I find it a very hospitable country. But obviously, things have changed. I'll tell you, I went, of course, to the demonstrations in Amman, and thousands of people who were there. And again, we've talked about this before, but of course, when you're there and you're sensing and feeling it firsthand, it's a little bit different than discussing it academically or theoretically on television. But the chants not just death to Israel, which of course they're chanting, death to America and death to the Jews, right? Those are the chants, those are the words they're using. It is ugly, it is horrific, and it's explicit what they're trying to do. They're not hiding the ball here. They're saying the quiet part out loud. Death to Israel, death to America, death to the Jews. And, you know, it was interesting when I was crossing the border, which I've done over a dozen times from Jordan into Israel. And again, I've always found the border crossing guards to be very friendly to me. We've shared a coffee. We have to wait a little bit. As I was crossing over, they asked me, you know, where are you going? And of course, I said, I'm going to Israel. And they said, I don't know what that is. If you want to go, you can go to Palestine. I need to hear you stay. You want to go to Palestine. And at first I thought he was joking. And I said, you know, it's very funny. I said, no, we're not going to give you your we're going to stamp your transit card unless you say I am going to Palestine. To which point I said, yeah, I don't know what you think you're messing with. I'd rather sit here all day and not cross over than say I'm going to Palestine. I'm not going to play your game. And we were in a standoff for a couple of hours because I wouldn't say it. Finally, they were able to put me through because I had to call a couple of people who said enough with this. But yeah, the situation in Jordan is extraordinarily tense, as it is, I'm sure, in every Arab nation around the world, and certainly here in Israel.
And some of the anti-Semitism, conscious or unconscious, is just sickening. The UN Secretary General, I mentioned it yesterday, the socialist politician Anthony Guterres, with his comments saying, well, look, you know, it was terrible what Hamas did to Israel, but you've got to see it in context of the occupation. As in, you know, whatever Hamas now does, it's always the Jews' fault. Whatever Hamas does to Jews, well, the Jews really were asking for it. Sick. Army's sick. It's absolutely disgusting what's going on.
Yeah, look, the UN comes from a long line of sick secretary generals, and this one is maybe the worst. And that's saying a lot considering one of them was a Nazi. Antonio Guterres is absolutely anti-Israel, bordering on anti-Semitic. He may be anti-Semitic. I don't know for sure. But his comments were striking, right? Okay, first of all, it's classic blame the victim. The left always bemoans, how can you blame the victim? That's exactly what he's doing. But he's also, again, pushing blood libels, right? It's not just that he's saying that Israel deserved it, which he is, but also continues the lies that we've debunked over and over and over again, saying that Israel is targeting civilians, right? This is the lie they're pushing on the left. This is the blood libel, which leads to the deaths that we saw in Israel in the hands of butchers.
Our own Prime Minister. Our own Prime Minister implying that Israel had deliberately targeted a hospital and not retracting that insinuation. Ami Horowitz, keep safe. Thank you for your time. After the break, the new populace being sold by the army. And the ABC has invented a new word for women. Things fall apart. I mean, look at this. The Army shop, Air Force shop, Navy shop be selling a version of the famous Poppy of Remembrance. This one, though, with the rainbow colours of the LGBTQ, etc., community. The RSL was even selling them until it suddenly got cold feet. Joining me as Sky News presenter James McPherson of The Late Debate here on Sky at 10 p.m. and Evelyn Ray, writer and commentator, and now regular on the new show here on Sky Sunday Showdown. James, in how many ways is that rainbow poppy a bad idea?
Well, the idea was at the Bendigo RSL to have a display for military officers who were, quote, serving in silence to honour gay soldiers. There's nothing wrong with honouring gay soldiers. The problem is when you co-opt a sacred symbol like the poppy and transform it into a gay pride image. Now, the poppy is supposed to represent the blood of soldiers shed for their country despite their sexuality. So it's already inclusive, but by turning it into a gay pride symbol, you take an inclusive, sacred image and you turn it into something else. That's the problem here, Andrew.
Evelyn, what do you make of it? I mean, I would have thought the whole idea of the poppy, united in death, but still we're segregating exactly the, people by their sexuality, even the dead.
Look, it's absolutely hijacking it all. And even my laryngitis isn't going to stop me from speaking up about something that's so disrespectful and inappropriate, out of place to our forefathers. And if you want to know how inappropriate it is, try to appropriate Pride Month with one of our causes and see how well that goes down.
Oh, absolutely correct. Here's another way we're falling apart with this identity politics. This American academic, 50 years old, born male, now identifies as a woman and even entered a swimming competition against girls aged just 13 and 14. The swim organisers said, well, what do we do?
But Mr. Chan, what I don't understand is that 9 out of the 10 participants were female and either 13 or 14, and the 10th participant was a male, 50 years of age.
Okay, so as I said, don't talk about gender for me, because I do not know, because the registration, whatever they enter, this is a 13 years old girl.
Yes.
So the registration in Swimming Canada, as I say, when the entries comes in, we're validating, we only have a girl and male event.
James, you look at that and surely anyone's got to think this is absolutely insane.
You know what's hilarious about this, Andrew, is that the swimmer in question, the 50-year-old biological man, Melody is the name of this person, is a professor at York University. And do you know what Melody specialises in? Cognitive flexibility. It requires a fair bit of cognitive flexibility for a 50-year-old biological man to imagine himself as a 13-year-old girl. And it requires a fair bit of cognitive flexibility for the organisers to say they didn't want to get into a debate about age or gender, as if there's something to debate about those things. This is another example of language being manipulated to try and push a cause. If it wasn't so crazy, it would be hilarious.
I just don't understand. The public must be well trained now, totally intimidated, Evelyn, because I would have thought one of the parents of one of the 13 or 14-year-old girls must have, should have gone up to this guy and said, get off, get out of here, give the girls their go. I mean, for heaven's sake.
I think everybody's too scared because we all know what happens when the mob comes after you. You get cancelled, and not only cancelled, you get revenge attacks. It's a scary sort of thing to do, and people want to avoid that. But unfortunately, we can't look to event organisers to fix these things. Girls are unfortunately the ones who are going to have to miss out, and the only way to do that is by sacrificing, competing against these guys. And they're already going to lose anyway, because we already know that biological men most of the time outdo biological women in sport. And it's really hard and it shouldn't happen, but that's the reality of it, and that's the only way it's going to get fixed. But maybe this sort of thing is going to be the undoing of all of this, because the more absurd that things get, the more that as everyday Australians and everyday human beings around the world are going to be awake to what's really going on and maybe finally put a stop to the ludicrous and stupidity of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. One would hope anyway. Last example, so many. The ABC, James, has run this bizarre headline. As prices for sanitary products steadily increase, Australians with periods are feeling the pinch. Now, what do you think a normal person would call an Australian with periods?
Well, Andrew, speaking as an Australian who doesn't have a period, I've got no idea what the ABC are talking about. This is a classic example of language being manipulated to push a particular ideology, which is the exact opposite of what a news organisation is supposed to do. When you're reporting news, you're meant to be clear and concise. So you would say women rather than Australians with periods. They are just pushing an ideological bent here, which is why you should get your news from somewhere other than the ABC.
Now, Evelyn, your voice is just hanging out for the end. We've only got 20 seconds. What do you make of it?
It's an insult to women anywhere, and any woman who doesn't think so is one sandwich short of a picnic. But if you're getting your news from the ABC, you've got bigger problems.
What can you say? The whole thing is just so bad. Also, sanitary products is already a euphemism, but now Australians with periods. Evelyn Ray, James McPherson, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Well, that is it from me for tonight, for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. Coming up next is Chris Kenny. Good night.